Hey, we have our last panel, which we call Panel of Protégées. That's a group of younger people who represent, I think, in a good way, the range of educational commitments that Frank thought important. Luyen Chou and Josh Reibel, who are both very active in the conjunction of commerce and technology and education. They are in policy-making positions within major companies and competing with each other, having been roommates at Harvard at one point, I believe. Liliana Pinto, who is, like Frank, the head of, or even higher than Frank, the head of a very wonderful school in Mexico, and has been one of his most valued doctoral students here at Teachers College, and here from originally Argentina and now Mexico. Kelsey, who is a major figure at the Helmsley Foundation and active in making technology and education decisions about how the philanthropic sector should be involved in all of this. Tucker Harding, who is currently on the staff of CC and MTL, a educational technologist and educator. And then two young academics, David Miele, whom we've heard from, and Lalitha Vasudevan, who is the coordinator of the program at Teachers College in Communication, Computing, and Technology, in which Frank and I both taught for many years. I want to hearken back to Frank's dissertation work on Roman funerals. When I first heard that Frank had died, and I knew that I was going to be involved in memorial service for him, I asked myself, how can one have a service for someone whose sense of one of his key academic achievements was to explicate the educational value of public funerals in the Roman world. This occasion where we are in a public setting within a major university, recording things for others to look at, should they choose to do so, is in a sense, I think, Frank's public funeral. And I think it's something of his achievement to realize that in the Roman world, to have a public funeral was something that was reserved for those who had made a major impact. And I think that that is also the case of this kind of a service within a university. It does not happen for everyone. To recognize that Frank achieved this status by a great deal of hard work and risk-taking and using his head, coming from what were relatively obscure in an academic sense origins. He made his mark. Now, how in the Roman world, when someone died, their achievements moved from the world of public activity into the world of the ancestors, the predecessors, where people would look back on them as standards of worth, of standards of excellence that one should aspire to among the living. And the whole pedagogical power of the Roman funeral was that everybody was aware that the work of a man of some stature was being transferred from those of the living to those of the dead. And that it was the burden of the living to consider those standards of worth, to internalize them, and to decide how they can best do and what they can best do in the face of the demands for action that they perceive in the world. And it is to speak in that spirit, somewhat as one might have spoken as a young person or a younger person, looking back on someone one reveres and respects in their achievement, and looking forward to the field of action that you feel yourself engaged in as a follower and furtherer of that person's work that I'd like to ask each to speak. So there are really two questions. What do you see in Frank as the embodiment of human worth that you most deeply recognize and respect? And then with that as a measure of attainment, what do you think is most important to address as the arena of action in your own efforts? And I purposely not told people in what order they're exactly going to go in, but I'd like to ask Ryan to start that off.
Any reason for why that's the case, Robbie?
It's the fates of...
The fates, yes, of course, of course. I should have known.
It's not planned.
I should have known, yeah. So I said this before to people. Frank likes to say things in threes, and I've said this, so people have heard me say this before. And I always thought it was because he wanted to keep it short for the people he was talking to, but it was really for him to remember the three things he wanted to say. And so I tried to emulate that. But there's really one of the three that I wanted to focus on, so I'm going to be really quick with the other two because a lot's been said about them already. So the first is everyone's so far today spoke at length about how Frank was kind of a born natural teacher. But I wanted to add one twist to that, which was, to me, the way he did that was by being a lifelong student himself. By being committed to his own learning and bringing into whatever he was doing, whatever he was studying. And these things were kind of interchangeable, I think. They almost weren't, you couldn't disassociate them or decouple them in the way that I think a lot of classic education is done, where these things are sort of in their compartments and sort of thought about, well, I go over here to do my course and then I go to work and I go home. And for him, these barriers did not exist. And that was something I really tried to model myself on as best I could, and I could in no way endure it at the level of energy and persistence that he was able to. The second comment, which has also been talked about a bit, is this sense of engagement with others, being able to, in such a rapid way, and this, to me, it was the speed at which he could do this that was so impressive, that he could connect with an individual, find something in common with them, find something that he could relate to them with, and zero in on that and understand your sense of whatever that was, and then propel you forward in whatever that was. In the same way that people were offered books, as I think Tom mentioned, and others, and it didn't have to be academic. It could be about anything. That was the second point that is always on my mind. But the one I want to focus on is requires me to tell a story that, or a bit of a bit of a tale that Frank has said many times that many of you have probably heard, and it has to do with the three umpires. People know the three umpire story? Yes. Okay, so for those of you who don't know the three umpire story, and I couldn't find the source for this. Google does not know all things. The first umpire, when he's judging the balls and strikes, he calls them as they are. So that's a certain kind of truth. You know, they are what they are. They're separate from him. The second umpire calls them as he sees them. So which sense is a little bit different. There's some kind of interpretation going on there. But Frank was really interested in the third umpire's point of view, and that is, they're nothing, they ain't nothing until I call them. Like there's no ball or strike separate until I make a judgment of some kind. And that, for me, in my professional life, has been the most meaningful comment that I take with me and I think about on a daily basis. So Robbie mentioned it just very briefly, but what I essentially do now is I'm a grant maker in higher education. So I'm charged with recommending how a very large sum of money is spent to further the innovation of teaching and learning all over the country. And that requires, and that through self-imposed pressure and pressure of others, requires, I think, a kind of unachievable sense of judgment about where to place certain bets and see what happens. And, you know, I know some people, when they hear the umpire story, at first they think, well, there's a certain amount of hubris in that third umpire, sort of, well, the world doesn't exist until I say it does. But that's not how I look at it. I think of it more like I owe it to the people that I serve, in the same way Frank owed it to every child that he served, to put my entire intellectual and emotional force into what I'm doing and to make the best choices I can. And then, as he and I used to laugh at each other because we said it so many times, we'll see. You know.
Ryan.
Yes.
The three umpires are from Lisa Leahy.
Oh, yeah.
And her colleague, Bob Keegan.
Oh, yeah.
Lisa's here with her husband.
Oh, terrific. Thank you, Gardner. So, yeah, I would just close by saying that I try to think of myself like that third umpire as best I can, and I get to carry forward Frank's hopes and thoughts and our collective successes and failures with me to every campus I visit, and you know, to every policy decision that I'm fortunate enough to be a part of. And you know, I'll never forget everything I had because of him here. I met him on my second day. We were talking about, of all plays, Antigone. So if you know that play. I studied that play and happened to be in that same course that David was talking about in his presentation, and that was the play we read at the beginning of the term. So I had something to say as I said, 14-year-old who knew nothing from Oregon. So anyway, thanks, Robbie. Yeah.
Liliana?
Wait a moment. So, good morning, everybody. Fortunately, Robbie told us in advance what this panel was going to look like, and I never really trusted my English. CC and MTL staff know that. So I wrote down my answer. If you don't mind, I will read it for you. Robbie's question takes me back to a phrase I heard Frank once said. If you want to get an education, you should go places you weren't supposed to be. You should, have you heard that? Yes. Places you weren't supposed to be. Once I overcame the literal interpretation of this sentence, I found myself understanding the meaning of an uncomfortable questions, the hard and complex process of removing yourself from well-known certainties, the commitment to engage in questioning the way you talk and the choice of words you make. Being in places you weren't supposed to be takes you to a journey of self-exploration, critique, and deconstruction. Reflecting on this sentence, I understood that Frank's classes were an attempt to embark as students in those kind of journeys. His "so what" question represented an invitation to engage us in another level of interpretation and meaning-making. Frank mastered that art, the art of combining mind and soul to go and take you places you weren't supposed to be. And education, a meaningful one anyway, should be such a journey, such an adventure of self-discovery, surprise, and reconstruction. Technology, meaningfully shaped, should help us develop and extend this educational experience. Now, some years later, and finding myself struggling to understand the complexity of school change from within, I come back to this idea of an education and realize how urgent is our need for educators willing to go places they shouldn't supposed to be. We need teachers to move into uncomfortable places, to ask the hard and difficult questions, to face unknown challenges, and to do so both as personal journeys, as collective processes. And we strongly need educational leaders, as Frank was, capable of inspiring others into this adventure, and to do so with passion, commitment, and exemplary actions. I think Frank showed us what that journey might look like, and it is with us now. It is the challenge that we have in our hands to move this journey forward. Thank you.
That was beautiful. Well, Frank was very interested in legacy, and and by that I don't mean his own, or his building up a sort of case for his renown or place in history. In fact, I think he was quite recoiled against pedagogical modalities that were based in a kind of narcissism and solipsistic need to kind of impart aggressively on kids and make a place for the teacher making a place for himself or herself. But in the sense that Robbie opened the day with, that Frank was always reaching very far back into the past in order to forge something in the future. And I also have a list of three. I don't know if that's because of Frank or just because I'm trying to keep track of what I wanted to say. But there were three things that Frank really represented to me that I very much hope are alive in the work I'm doing today, and then I'll tell a little story about one of those pieces of work. So the first, I guess, is this idea of Frank as the servant teacher, which I think has gotten plenty of discussion today, that we all have a sense of what I mean by that, but that, again, Frank's continued sense that teaching was about subordinating oneself to the possibilities of the learner and not the other way around. And the second is, in all of his curriculum work, he really understood that that formal teaching is about staging a drama and having creating all the suspense and narrative drive and sense of discovery that's inherent in drama, in the theater, in television, in movies, and stories. And the third is that the kind of richness and thorough engagement that was part and parcel of all the dramas he staged didn't need to come at the expense of rigor, and that, in fact, the other way around, that that the deepest academic rigor could come from a well-staged drama rather than a more didactic way of teaching. So, and I think you saw that just in the couple of clips of young sixth graders from the Archetype project, just the vocabulary and intellectual tools that they were wielding at age 11 or 12 couldn't possibly not be impressive to any observer of schools. So I now oversee about 1,200 employees, and there's one who is of particular importance today, and that's Nico Moretti, Frank's son, who works with me now. And Nico is, I might have to tell Luyen to leave before I start telling the story because there's competitive information here. Nico's doing some work in our company now that Frank would be just so proud of, and to me just so thoroughly represents a great deal of Frank's thinking in all three of those areas. And we are, among other things, developing digital curriculum now for middle school English language arts. And Nico is a key leader in a group that is building a thing that we call quests, which are multi-day, 3 to 5 day culminations of academic units in the course where the kids have both opportunity to demonstrate to themselves, each other, their teachers, what they have amassed as capability and skill and knowledge. And also just have a lot of fun. They take the form of murder mysteries and other kinds of narratives that, that are part of the staging of a drama. And they've got all sorts of rich media and surprises in them and so on. And when I'm spending a lot of time now on the road showing video of these quests as they've been done in trials to potential customers of them for next school year. And every time I watch the Edgar Allan Poe quest, which is the first piece of work that Nico and his team completed, I think that Frank would be so thrilled to know that one of his students was leading one of his children in the development of work that just so captured everything that he believed in terms of what should go on in classrooms. So thank you, Nico, for helping us continue Frank's legacy.
Thank you, Frank. Tucker?
So most of us here knew Frank in a variety of different capacities. We had different kinds of relationships with him, and working in the office with him especially, you were prone to lots of instantaneous and spontaneous conversations that could arise at any moment about just about anything. You'd frequently refer to something he might have known you were reading or a comment you had made in one of his classes or something like that. But there were lots of opportunities for these mini dialogues to occur all the time. They were ongoing. And over time, getting to know him better, and as he got to know you better, it became clear, if you were able to kind of step back from that whole interaction a little bit, that all of those mini dialogues were really part of a much larger conversation. And this is a conversation that I want to talk about here. It's Frank's ongoing conversation. It's a conversation that he was able to invite anyone into, any person. And it was remarkable how many different kinds of people he knew, how many people he brought into his life in different ways from all walks of life and all different experiences. If you were able to engage with him, you were part of this bigger conversation that he wanted you to also be a part of. At times, it could seem like ultimately this larger conversation could really secretly be about you the whole time. Not the ideas that you had, or not the comments you were making, or the stories you were telling, but really about you as a person. But it's actually bigger than that even. It's really a conversation, depending on how you look at it, about us, about people generally, about humanity. It's about who we are and what we value, the things that we decide to spend our time doing, the things we decide to invest ourselves into. And it's a conversation about what we plan to do with our circumstance, about the decisions that we make and how we can follow through on them. As Frank would frequently say, we live in a world that's filled with lots of different kinds of forces that are always acting on us. And some of them are from within ourselves. And we have to recognize what they are and where they come from. And some of them are external to us. They're forces that would have us behave in certain ways, or desire certain things, or value certain things, and so on. But by welcoming people into this conversation, I think what Frank was really trying to do was to create a shared description of our shared circumstances in order that they might be illuminated in some way through those interactions we would have with him. And to illuminate them can lead to making sense of them, when sometimes it might seem very difficult to do that. And the goal of making sense of the circumstance we're in was really always to empower the individual. The awareness within each person of their abilities to take control of the circumstance, to determine for themselves the things that they will value, the things that they will do, the things that they believe in. In this view of this larger conversation that he was seemingly always having with almost all people all the time, is really manifest in all the different kinds of people that he knew and the different relationships that he had. And importantly, in the different initiatives and organizations that he helped create, which were, in a sense, a way of moving the conversation forward. Building these organizations like CCMTL was a way of broadening the conversation, creating a space for people to enter into it with him and with all of us interested in education. At the center, we have to battle a lot of stereotypes all the time about what it is we actually do, spend our time doing, and what we value. We frequently have to reframe our building of educational technology, not as something that we do to put out and hope that something great happens because of it. But really our core mission is to build partnerships with people in education, with faculty, with librarians, with administrators, with students, researchers, and outside organizations. And I think this idea of building the partnership was really a way of welcoming that variety of people into this larger conversation. Frank's not the one, obviously, who started this bigger conversation. But what he was really exemplary at was boosting it up and making it so large and visible that it was almost impossible to not be aware that this was happening, that this human dialogue about the things we struggle with, the problems we're trying to solve, and so on, is happening, and that everyone has an invitation to be a part of it. And that every individual voice within this conversation mattered a great deal, because without them, the conversation stops. So with him having left us now, part of what he's left is this huge community of very active participants in this conversation. And these are people who can keep the open invitation to anyone. And it's kind of a responsibility that I see with myself, and I think a lot of the members of the staff and others feel similarly, that we have an obligation now, one that we're happy to fulfill, to keep that invitation to join this conversation open with anyone who's interested in our shared human condition, and using education as a way of broaching that conversation. So we have to find ways of continuing to make that whole idea kind of the centerpiece of people's educational experiences, and we can do that in different ways. So Frank's conversation is something that we can work hard to boost up and to keep as visible as it has been for so many years now. And I think everyone here would agree that this is something we're able to do, and this is something that we will be continuing to work on doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Luyen, continue the conversation.
Really incredibly touching and meaningful words from everyone, and I hope everyone feels the, this is such a fitting memorial in that it connects so many dots in my own mind that I hadn't connected until this day, and so that's an incredibly revelatory experience for myself. But I will say that listening to everything today, if you didn't know Frank, you might think that he was a very serious, dour intellectual. And in fact, for all of us who knew him so well, he was quite the opposite. The memories that stick with me the most when I think about Frank are those of him driving the beast recklessly up Park Avenue, shouting threats and epithets to the cars around him, and driving with an egg sandwich and a coffee to the beach in the Hamptons to watch the waves and the birds and the fish, and coming down to watch Knicks games with Josh and me on 36th Street. I think it goes without saying that Frank lived life with an unparalleled sense of gusto and enjoyment. He attacked life voraciously the way that he would a cheesesteak or a hamburger. But at the same time, he was this intellectual giant. I mean, he was unparalleled in the level of his exposure to texts, to ideas. He read voraciously. Tom and I were talking about this. You looked at any of his books, they were just covered with marginalia with yellow sticky notes. I mean, he didn't just read a book, he lived in the book. So he could easily, as a teacher and as a mentor for a young kid who first got to know him in high school, be intimidating. But that wasn't Frank. Frank wanted to be your best pal. And he wanted to really instill in you a sense that you could live life with the same attentiveness to the serious intellectual aspects of it, but be a real human being at the same time, and that both of those were the yin and yang of his existence. This has been a continuing theme, and I thought, Josh, you said it really well, and I just wrote it down here. You know, this unassailable, that teaching is about subordinating oneself to the potential of the learner. And it never really struck me till today, and I'm Mr. Obvious here, that drove both his, the way that he interacted with other human beings, the way he lived his life, but it was also the source of the brilliance behind the archetypes and the brownfields of the world, that there was again, this parallel between the affective way that he approached people around him, the way he lived his life, and his intellectual belief in what teaching and learning could be. He had an unassailable conviction in the a priori potential of the young. And by the young, that really meant anyone who was in a position of lesser experience than himself, at least by their own perception. Frank always thought you had more potential than you thought you had. And that was an incredibly powerful gift he had, because it made you hold yourself to a higher standard. But this notion of teaching being about subordinating oneself to the potential learner resulted in both this kind of unusual mentor relationship with such a huge generation of individuals, but also in this conviction on how more structured teaching and learning could take place in the classroom. And those are things that, like Josh, have sort of guided my life, both in the way that I interact with those younger than me now, but also in my professional and intellectual pursuits, also in the business of education. And there's Tom said I had to tell this story, so I'll end with this, and partly because, well, I'll get to it, but so Josh and I now, there's sort of delicious irony being that we've spent so much of our lives together, and now we work for two global education companies that are, in more cases than not, competing all across the world to hopefully to really lift educational prospects for people around the world. While Nico now works for Amplify and News Corp and Josh, Antonio actually works for my company, for Pearson, and actually arrived at, he's been working for us for a while, but we got a brand new gleaming facility down in Tribeca, and he showed up the other day, and he's sitting at a desk about no more than 20 feet away from me. Antonio is doing incredibly important work in rethinking and researching new ways, next generation approaches to teacher evaluation, which is an incredibly important work, and is a real rising star at the company. But the story I wanted to tell very quickly was I had, as Frank was sort of living through his final days, I had the great honor and pleasure of being able to come and visit him, and I remember in one of the last visits, Frank was already at a point where he was really non-responsive, and I'd been there enough times to know that he was much more aware of what was going on than he could let on, but his ability to actually engage with anyone around him was minimal, at least when I was there. And the time before that, I'd come with Josh. I brought a framed photograph of Josh and me with Frank in the middle, and then the two of us on the end, and then Antonio and Nico. And it was a photograph from a Labor Day party I had thrown the prior year. And we had a great time. It was like old times. It was a big party, and it was great having multiple generations there. And Tom DeZangatita was there, and we'd been there for maybe an hour, and we were really talking and reminiscing around Frank, and with Frank as the opportunity, the occasion to do that. And I saw the photograph there. It was right behind Frank's head. And up to this point, Frank had had no expression whatsoever. And I turned to Tom and I said, you know, Tom, it's such a funny world that Frank has helped us to create. And I was explaining about Josh's and my company's rivalries, and the fact that, you know, Nico was working for Josh, and that Tonio had just started to work for Pearson. And all of a sudden, Frank's face just lit up with this huge smile. And not only had he been aware of the entire conversation, but he had this look of both a real appreciation for the deliciousness of that a moment, and also a look on his face that told me, I told you so. I knew it all along. So anyway, that would be my story.
Lalitha?
So, I think it's officially good afternoon. I'm here to speak a little bit in a few different capacities. One, I'm speaking as a faculty member in the Communication, Computing, and Technology and Education at Teachers College in the Department of Math, Science, and Technology, where Frank, as well as Robbie and some of my colleagues who are here in the audience, were colleagues together. And I want to talk a little bit about his role in that program, but I want to start with the first time I met Frank, which was during my interview for the position I currently hold. And I finally found my way to Lewison Hall. It took me a few minutes. And I walked in, and he was seated, and he was rolling from one shelf to another, looking for something. And he saw me standing in the doorway, and he said, "Come in, come in, come in, come in, come in." And so I was in my interview best, and I sat down, and very nervous, still in the throes of the interview, wanting to make a good impression. And he said, "Have you seen this?" And he handed me a copy of the journal Souls, which is, I think, published here at Columbia. I think he and some colleagues had just written a piece in it. And I didn't know what to do. I said, "No, I haven't seen this." And he said, okay, sit down. Now I'm supposed to be interviewing you, right? All right, well, let's just talk. And we started talking. And within about 90 seconds, I was not a candidate for a job. I was a person having a conversation with an incredibly interesting person. And we went well over our allotted 30 minutes. But what I left feeling was the same feeling that I had every time I had even the most passing encounter with Frank, which was weighted down with so many more questions than I had walked in with, clearly, but somehow just a little bit lighter, that I had engaged in the stuff of life for just a few minutes, or for half an hour, or for a lunch. And I thought about this moment, and I thought about really my feeling in that moment, which was a moment of reassurance, because here I was, an anthropologist of education with a background in literacy and adolescence, applying for a job in a technology and education program. But I was reassured in that conversation that background and a humanities tether would make sense in an educational technology focus. I thought about that first interaction actually this summer, when it was just about a week after Frank had passed away, and I found myself at BlackRock. I had taken some colleagues and some students there for a project retreat that we had planned well before I knew, I had learned of Frank's passing. And Frank had always said for several years, "You should go, you would love it. Oh, people should go, it's fabulous." And so it felt somehow both fitting but incredibly sad to be there, really in the wake of his passing, but somehow deeply appropriate to be there to start what has been, the last several months of recollections with colleagues and students about who Frank was and how he left indelible marks in their lives. So I'm speaking for myself, but I also want to say a couple of things about some encounters that students have had. And so I think I was in my second or third year in the faculty, and I remember a couple of students coming to my office, sitting down, closing the door very seriously. They were taking Frank and Robbie's class, and they said, "We need to talk to you." I said, "Oh, okay." I just don't know if, one of them said, "I just don't know if I can continue with the class." And I wasn't sure what the issue was. You know, theories of communication, this is good stuff, this history, you know. And they were unsettled, and they were uneasy, and they were challenged, and they didn't know if they were getting it. And in my mind, I think I saw the same smile that Luyen was just talking about, because I could imagine Frank just saying, "Aha, yes, exactly, that's it." And, you know, graduate school can be a really difficult place because you think you're supposed to know everything. But in fact, I think Frank understood you're supposed to unknow everything. You're supposed to sit deep in the space of your unknowing and cultivate, as so many people have said, a relationship, a new relationship with learning. And it was wonderful to see those students. This makes me sound terribly sadistic, but it was wonderful to see those students squirm because they didn't get it immediately. And that was a hallmark of Frank. You know, if I talked earlier about Frank as teacher in the moment, this was Frank as teacher in the classroom. A third very brief story happens to take place, not exactly, yes, in our department meeting in math, science, technology. And this would happen frequently, so this is sort of a portrait of several times this happened. And I loved seeing Frank in the department meetings because there was always, with a few minutes left, Frank would raise a question. And they often started out, and the questions often started out with, "Can you imagine?" This is not the discourse that happens in a department meeting, right? We're there, we have to get things done, we have a allotted sense of time, and people have so many other things to do. And this would happen frequently. And for some reason, you know, people would stop packing up their things, and we would imagine for a couple of minutes where Frank invited us to go. And particularly in an educational climate where so much has to be consequential and instrumental and purpose-driven, Frank embodied what I think Emerson said, where he said, you know, truly speaking, it's not instruction, but provocation that I can receive from another soul. And Frank was just putting provocations into the world all the time. And these weren't substance-free provocations, they were substance-full, that kind of ongoing conversation that Tucker was talking about. And so you knew that at the depth of every fleeting comment and question that Frank invited us to think about, there was a depth of inquiry and a depth of deep desire for education in the broadest, most beautiful sense of the word. So there's one other quote I want to leave you with, and it's one that I thought of when I was watching a short speech that Frank gave, in the beginning of which he says, you know, he wants to remind us, those of us who work in digital media and communication and educational technology, he said to not get lost in the luminosity of media. You know, don't give in to that, because then you're not getting to the stuff. And there's a beautiful documentary about Frank Gehry, the architect. And there's a scene in there where Frank Gehry's, you know, quickly constructing something, and he looks at it. And he says to Sidney Pollack, who's doing the interview, "That is so stupid looking, it's great." And for some reason, that makes me think of Frank, that he saw the world for all and more that it could be. And we're happy to have had him as our faculty member.
So I guess, like Tom, batting cleanup, so I'll try to keep it brief. I guess, so I want to really speak to this notion of pietas that Robbie mentioned at the beginning, the idea of how do I, or more how should I, because I probably don't do it as well as I probably should, actually live out the legacy of the ideals that Frank represented. And I want to talk very briefly about this on both, you know, a personal level and, you know, and in terms of my actual work. So just to give you a little context from what I'm about to say, you know, just briefly, you know, I work in kind of developmental educational psychology. My research focus specifically is looking at how students regulate their own learning. So what I mean by that is I'm very interested in how students metacognitively assess their own learning, how they basically determine when they do or don't know something, and how they use that information to make decisions about how to further their learning, how to move forward with their study and pick, new strategies for interacting with the material that they're trying to engage and learn. And okay, so that being said, I want to start off with a kind of more personal anecdote, which is, so I've known Frank my whole life, and when I was younger, Frank was a very intimidating figure, as I think a lot of people have already kind of mentioned. I mean, just because of the intensity with which he lived life. And, so it wasn't really that I didn't really get to know Frank as an adult who had, that I could share certain kinds of internal experiences with until maybe I graduated college. And there was one particular instance where the college was, was a great time, but it was also a tough time, and it was, I remember experiencing a lot of existential angst, and revisiting my deeply held assumptions from before college, and that these are the kind of things that would routinely keep me up at night, And I remember sitting down for lunch. I think we were at the little Indian cafe that Frank used to like to eat on like 121st or 22nd. I'm sure he brought a lot of you guys there. And I'm not sure how the conversation started, but basically at some point I kind of share with Frank that I'm like not sleeping so well. I'm not, and then I'm, up, thinking about this stuff, and Frank turns to me and he goes, "The bewitching hour." and he's like, "Yeah, I was up at 2 a.m. yesterday, combing through these, postmodern books and wrestling with this and that, and it both simultaneously terrified me that he would say that and comforted me at the same time, because here's this, 50-something-year-old man, and you're still experiencing similar feelings that I was hoping that I would, be able to get past in the next year or two. And he's telling me that I had another, 20, 30 years at least of sleepless nights to look forward to. But at the same time comforting because, for Frank, he wasn't saying it, he reveled in it, just in the way I just said it, the bewitching hour. He reveled in that moment. He thought of it as like the purest part of his existence when he was up wrestling with his own, not only his own demons, but his own deeply held convictions and beliefs. And I think you just said it best, I think, Lalitha, that it's carving out a time where you can still sit in your place of unknowing, even as an adult. And this is an important side of Frank I don't think necessarily people understood because of the fact that he seemed like such an extrovert, and his intellect seemed to be directed very much outward. But for most of the time, it was very much directed inward. And he was constantly, kind of interrogating himself in this way. And so that's the part that I learned, that it's okay to keep interrogating your intellectual assumptions. In fact, it's desirable. It might still be painful, but it's worth it. And there's some kind of perverse enjoyment in it at times. So I have to remind myself, because I don't have the capacity for it that Frank does. I don't think many people do. But I have to remind myself not to be complacent sometimes and to challenge myself in the way that I think. And then the other thing is more directly related to my work, is that I didn't necessarily, realize how much of an influence both Frank and Robbie had on what I actually ended up choosing to study. But this idea that I'm interested in metacognition, interested in the idea of how we, reflect our own experiences, our own learning, it derives from what I was just talking about. But also this idea of how to then marshal that so that we can help learners, basically self-regulate their own learning, move towards their own learning goals that only they can decide to pursue. I mean, we as educators, we're so concerned with what content do students need to know in order to be really prepared when they come out of college. But I think Frank understood is that there's no way you could anticipate really what they're gonna need to know. What you need to be able to do is to be able to give them the skills to be able to go out and learn what's important to them. And so, so that's, just studying how that works at a psychological, a cognitive and affective motivational level is what I do. And I guess I'll say these 4 points, that I try to keep with me in terms of my work, which is that first, that formal and academic, I guess, intellectual kind of learning can and perhaps should be a lifelong endeavor. It begins in a way that is really regulated by external forces, right, such as parents and teachers. But if it begins for them at all, if they're lucky enough to have those kinds of models in their life, but it eventually shifts to become more internally regulated by the learner. And that means that at a certain point, the role of the educator becomes to kind of facilitate that shift and to give the learner the tools to be successful on their own. Like I was saying, to pursue their learning goals that are unique to that individual. And then finally, in order to get students to shift in that way, to shift from external to internal regulation, to really think for themselves, it's sometimes necessary to confront them in ways that force them to take a personal stand, to say that this is what I know, this is what I believe. And I'm reminded of the phrase that Frank used a lot of times in a lot of different contexts, but I think it's appropriate here, which is to put your tootsies to the fire. And it's only at this point, that you can really begin to think constructively about how to further your own learning and the meaning of your own life. Thank you.
Thank you for all letting your tootsies be put to the And Luyen mentioned the potentiality of the young, and I'd just like to suggest that relative to Frank now, no matter what age we are the young. And the questions that the panel has addressed of what they see most valuable in Frank's example and in the example of others who've passed before us is one question. And then what are we going to do in our world with the standards of excellence and meaning and worth that all of that, those examples present to us as measures of what we should aspire to for ourselves. So it's not only the panel, but everybody's tootsie should be at the fire. And now I think we have a little bit of time for some questions or comments or lunch. Yes, Melissa.
I was wondering if any of you guys could speak to something that he did that made you... Hello. If any of you guys would be willing to speak to something that he did that or said or thought that made you really angry or really frustrated and how you grappled with that and worked through it. Reason being, I'm only now coming to terms with some of the debates that we had kind of ongoing over the years. And they were just as important as the conversations where we were in total agreement. And I think that he would really want someone to speak to the things that, as he would say, pissed you guys off. So.
Good question. Most of us have answers. Whether we want to discuss them.
I can give a version of that, and it's not something. I can give a version of that. One of the things that I know Frank had shared a few times with students in our program and with colleagues in our program was, shall we say, a challenging view towards schooling. And this is a difficult thing to voice in a school of education. And I remember I was having a conversation with him, a little bit playing devil's advocate, because I was trying to engage with him in a conversation about some comments that students had either experienced in a difficult way, and one of the things he had said was, what is the point of schools, right? But what was behind that was, what is the point of schools in the way they're constructed now? And it was interesting because I was trying to invite him to expand on that. And his response was, no, let's just leave that question aside. We have to move on. And it was really because my ethos resonated with him, but as a faculty member trying to negotiate, as a colleague trying to negotiate a little bit on behalf of my students, I was trying to get him to offer a few other perspectives. And it was this, and it was a really, it was actually after one of our department meetings. We were in our conference room, and Frank was unrelenting. He said, if we keep placating people's ideas of schools, then we're never going to get anywhere with with the actual kind of change we need. And it was a comment that both I understood, but left me frustrated, because he had gotten to that point because of the work and interactions and thinking he had done. And that was a difficult thing to translate to someone who is either currently in a school, many of our students are currently in schools when they were taking his courses, or studying to be a teacher in a school, so for people from outside of our program and within our program. And so that, I think, that kind of what might be seen as a productive tension wasn't always seen as a productive tension. So I'll just leave it at that.
Robbie, I can answer Melissa's questions, but maybe not things that got me upset, but some faults that he had. 3 faults. He was from New Jersey. He liked to root for the Georgetown Hoyas instead of the teams from the New York area. And then, as many of you know, we used to go throw the football out in front of Lewis and Hall, and he always threw the ball lefty. And anybody who knows catching a southpaw, it's really hard, and you see where that got Tim Tebow in his career. So those are the faults that I can remember.
Okay, well, I guess that we should adjourn for a while. At 3 o'clock, promptly, there'll be a memorial service starting in St. Paul's Chapel. So please, if you can come to it, please arrive a little bit early so that everybody can be seated. Following the service, there'll be a reception in Avery Library. I think it's probably one of the first receptions that have been permitted into the library space, so the students will be vacating for us, and I look forward to seeing you very much in a little while. Thank you.